"She's just a nobody," Daniel Carter said with a casual shrug. The kind of sentence meant to disappear into the music and laughter of a crowded ballroom, but somehow it didn't disappear at all. It floated above the marble floors and crystal chandeliers of the Manhattan Grand Gallery, hanging in the air long enough for half a dozen people nearby to hear it and smile politely, the way people do when they sense a story they'd rather watch than interrupt. Claire Whitmore heard it too, of course. She was standing only a few feet away, her fingers lightly curled around the stem of a champagne glass, the pale gold liquid catching the light from 1,000 tiny bulbs suspended from the vaulted ceiling nearly 30 feet above the floor. The annual Carter Foundation charity auction had always been extravagant, but tonight it looked especially dazzling. White orchids lined the center of every table. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Waiters moved through the room in perfect rhythm, balancing trays of sparkling drinks as guests in tailored tuxedos and silk evening gowns spoke in low, confident voices about investments, art collections, and the latest real estate deals stretching from Manhattan to Malibu. Claire blended into that world almost too easily. Her dress was elegant but simple, a soft ivory fabric that flowed just past her knees, paired with modest heels that clicked quietly against the polished stone floor. To most people in the room she looked like someone who worked behind the scenes of the event, an assistant maybe or part of the planning team. That assumption suited Daniel Carter just fine. He stood with one hand in the pocket of his dark suit, a glass of whiskey resting comfortably in the other, the posture of a man who had learned how to occupy expensive rooms with effortless authority. At 34 he was already known across New York as the founder of Carter Holdings, a company that had climbed from a small startup in a shared office to a corporation worth hundreds of millions of dollars in less than a decade. Success had sharpened his confidence and softened his memory at the same time. When he noticed Claire standing nearby, he tilted his head slightly, as if recognizing a face from a distant chapter of his life. For a second his expression hesitated, then amusement replaced it. "I didn't realize the staff mingled with the guests now," he added lightly, glancing toward the group of investors gathered beside him. A few chuckles rippled through the circle. None of them knew Claire personally, but they trusted Daniel's tone enough to follow his lead. Claire didn't react the way most people might have. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she lifted the glass slowly to her lips and took a small sip, her eyes moving across the ballroom as though the conversation behind her had never happened. From the stage at the far end of the hall, the master of ceremonies was announcing the beginning of the evening's auction, his voice echoing softly through hidden speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we gather not only to celebrate generosity, but to welcome the arrival of a new partner whose support will shape the future of this foundation." Applause drifted politely across the room. Daniel barely listened. He was still watching Claire with a faint, puzzled smile, trying to decide whether her silence meant embarrassment or indifference. He couldn't tell. The truth was something he never would have guessed. Because the woman he had just called a nobody had walked into the gala not as staff, not as a forgotten acquaintance, but as the quiet representative of a name that had shaped global finance for nearly half a century. And before the night ended, that name, Whitmore, was going to appear on a screen large enough for every guest in the ballroom to see. Claire Whitmore set the champagne glass down on a passing tray as the music in the ballroom shifted into a softer melody, the slow violin notes gliding beneath the quiet hum of hundreds of conversations, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe in the familiar scent of polished marble, fresh orchids, and expensive perfume that filled the Manhattan Grand Gallery. Daniel Carter's words still echoed faintly somewhere behind her, but they no longer carried any real weight. They sounded distant now, like a memory that belonged to another life, and in many ways it did. 5 years earlier the room would have looked very different to her. Back then Claire had stood in smaller spaces, borrowed offices with flickering fluorescent lights and scratched wooden desks where coffee cups left pale rings on legal papers. Daniel had been there too, younger, restless, full of ideas that moved faster than his resources. Carter Holdings had not existed yet, not in the form people admired tonight. It had been a concept scribbled across whiteboards and late-night notebooks, a company that lived mostly in Daniel's voice as he explained it with the hopeful confidence of someone who believed the future was only one opportunity away. Claire remembered those evenings clearly. She used to sit across from him with a laptop balanced on her knees, reviewing documents, organizing numbers, calling suppliers and investors who barely returned their calls. They worked inside a tiny office on the 10th floor of an aging building near Midtown, a place that measured barely 600 square feet and smelled faintly of old carpet and strong coffee. Daniel often joked that the entire company could fit inside the space between two Manhattan apartments, but Claire never laughed at that part. She believed in the company long before anyone else did. When investors ignored them, she rewrote proposals until 3 in the morning. When Daniel doubted himself, she reminded him why he started. In those days, Daniel used to say that Carter Holdings would not exist without her calm voice keeping everything steady. But success has a strange way of rewriting history. The first major investment arrived 2 years later, followed by new offices, new partners, and a growing circle of people who spoke about Daniel Carter, as though he had built everything alone through sheer brilliance. Claire had watched the transformation slowly unfold, the quiet shift in Daniel's tone when new investors entered the room, the careful introductions that gradually shortened her role from partner to assistant, and then from assistant to someone who no longer needed to attend certain meetings. The final change came the night Daniel introduced Olivia Grant, the daughter of a powerful venture capitalist who had recently joined Carter Holdings as a strategic partner. Olivia was elegant, confident, and very well connected. Daniel stood beside her that evening with the proud posture of a man who had finally reached the world he had always wanted to enter. Claire remembered the exact sentence he used when explaining the situation. He told her gently, almost kindly, that relationships sometimes needed to evolve along with success. What he meant was simpler than that. The future he envisioned did not include her. Claire had packed her things the following morning and left the office before sunrise, carrying a single leather bag through quiet Manhattan streets that smelled like rain and early morning traffic. She never told Daniel the truth he had overlooked from the beginning, that Whitmore Global Capital had been watching Carter Holdings from the sidelines long before its first investment arrived, and that the Whitmore name printed quietly on international financial reports belonged to the same woman who had once worked beside him in a 600-square-foot office with flickering lights. Tonight, as the master of ceremonies continued speaking on the stage and the room prepared for the first auction item, Claire stood calmly among the guests who believed she did not belong there, knowing that the past Daniel had dismissed was about to become the most important part of his future. The ballroom gradually filled with a deeper murmur of anticipation as the first auction item was rolled onto the stage beneath a circle of warm white light, a framed painting resting on a velvet stand while the master of ceremonies spoke with the confident rhythm of someone who understood exactly how to guide a room full of wealthy donors. Claire Whitmore stood near the edge of the crowd, her posture relaxed, her gaze drifting toward the tall windows that overlooked the glowing skyline of Manhattan, where thousands of lights flickered like distant stars above the Hudson River. Conversations floated around her in fragments about real estate deals, market predictions, and private collections worth more than most people would earn in a lifetime. Daniel Carter had moved only a few steps away after his earlier remark, now standing beside Olivia Grant near one of the tall cocktail tables where investors gathered in comfortable circles. Olivia looked exactly as the financial magazines described her, composed and radiant in a midnight blue gown, the daughter of a venture capitalist who had funded more than a dozen rising companies across the country. She rested a hand lightly on Daniel's arm, while listening to a man explain the value of a sculpture scheduled for the final auction lot. Daniel nodded politely, but his attention kept drifting back toward Claire, the same quiet curiosity returning to his expression every time he noticed her calm silence among the guests. Something about her presence felt out of place to him, not because she appeared uncomfortable, but because she did not appear uncomfortable at all. Most people who entered a room like this for the first time revealed it in small ways, in the careful way they observed the tables or the slight hesitation when speaking to strangers who carried influence. Claire showed none of that. She moved through the crowd with the same steady composure she had always carried, the same calm confidence Daniel used to admire years earlier when they worked late nights inside that cramped Midtown office. The auctioneer's voice rose slightly as the first bidding numbers appeared on a screen behind the stage, glowing white against a deep navy background, while assistants moved gracefully between tables to record offers from donors who raised small numbered paddles. Applause followed when the painting sold for nearly $200,000, and the room brightened again with the sound of glasses clinking together in celebration. A waiter passed by Claire with a tray of sparkling water and she accepted one, thanking him softly before turning her attention toward the stage where the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone with a tone that carried a different kind of excitement. He paused for a moment, allowing the room to settle as the musicians lowered their instruments and the quiet anticipation of hundreds of guests gathered beneath the chandeliers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice echoing gently across the hall, "before we continue with the next auction item, I would like to recognize the partner whose support made tonight's event possible." Several guests straightened in their chairs while others leaned slightly closer to the stage, the name of the foundation's new financial backer having been the subject of speculation throughout the evening. Daniel glanced toward the screen behind the podium, expecting the familiar logo of one of the investment groups he had been negotiating with for months. Carter Holdings had been preparing for this partnership carefully. The additional capital would expand the company into international markets and strengthen its position against several growing competitors. Daniel lifted his glass slowly, confident that the next few minutes would confirm everything he had worked toward. On the far side of the ballroom, Claire Whitmore listened to the same announcement with a calm expression, the soft light from the chandeliers catching the faint silver clasp of the small evening bag resting in her hand. She knew exactly what name was about to appear on that screen. And more importantly, she knew that Daniel Carter did not. The ballroom grew quieter as the master of ceremonies allowed the suspense to stretch for a few seconds longer, the soft glow of the chandeliers reflecting off polished marble floors while hundreds of guests turned their attention toward the large screen behind the stage. The orchestra had paused completely now, leaving only the faint clinking of glass and the low rustle of evening gowns shifting as people leaned forward with curiosity. "Our foundation is deeply grateful for the support of an organization whose commitment to long-term community investment has quietly shaped industries around the world," the host continued with a measured smile. Tonight's primary partner asked to remain anonymous until this moment. A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd like a gentle wave. Several investors exchanged thoughtful looks while others glanced toward Daniel Carter, assuming the new sponsor would soon be working closely with Carter Holdings. Daniel himself stood confidently beside Olivia Grant, one hand resting loosely around his whiskey glass while the other remained in his pocket. Olivia leaned closer, her voice soft with excitement. "This must be them," she whispered, her eyes moving toward the screen where the logo would appear. Daniel nodded slowly, his posture relaxed with the assurance of someone who believed he already understood how the night would unfold. Across the room, Claire Whitmore remained near the tall windows, her reflection faintly visible in the glass beside the distant Manhattan skyline. The city stretched below like a sea of golden lights across the Hudson River, and the dark outlines of buildings rising hundreds of feet into the night sky. Claire watched the stage quietly, her expression calm, almost thoughtful, as though the moment unfolding in front of everyone else had already passed through her mind hours earlier. The master of ceremonies lifted a small remote in his hand and turned slightly toward the screen behind him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said clearly, his voice filling the entire gallery through hidden speakers, "please join me in welcoming the organization that made tonight possible." The lights dimmed just slightly, focusing attention on the enormous display that covered nearly the entire wall behind the stage. For a brief moment the screen remained dark. Then a clean white background appeared, followed by a single word slowly fading into view in elegant silver letters. "Whitmore." The room reacted immediately. Several guests straightened in their seats while others whispered to one another with sudden recognition. The Whitmore name was not just another investment firm. Whitmore Global Capital had funded infrastructure projects across continents, guided financial partnerships worth billions of dollars, and quietly influenced markets from New York to London and Singapore for decades. Olivia's eyes widened slightly as she read the name glowing above the stage. "Whitmore Global Capital," she said softly, almost to herself. Daniel felt the same flicker of surprise pass through his thoughts. He had heard the name many times during negotiations over the past year. Their representatives had been cautious, distant, always communicating through advisors without revealing exactly who would represent them at events like this. Still, Daniel quickly recovered his confident smile. A partnership with Whitmore would mean tremendous opportunity for Carter Holdings. He raised his glass again, preparing to applaud along with the rest of the room. On the far side of the gallery, Claire Whitmore watched the reaction unfold with quiet composure. The silver letters continued to glow above the stage while the master of ceremonies raised his hand gently to calm the growing excitement among the guests. And tonight, he continued with a warm smile, Whitmore Global Capital is represented here in person. The room grew still again as dozens of curious faces turned toward the stage, waiting for the representative to stand. Daniel glanced around the crowd, searching for a powerful executive or senior partner he might recognize. Instead, several people near the tall windows slowly stepped aside as Claire Whitmore began walking toward the center of the ballroom. The soft echo of heels against marble seemed louder than the orchestra had been only minutes earlier as Claire Whitmore walked calmly through the parted crowd, the quiet path forming ahead of her as if the room itself had slowly decided to make space. The silver letters of Whitmore continued to glow above the stage while guests turned their heads one by one, first with mild curiosity and then with unmistakable confusion as they realized the woman approaching the center aisle was the same quiet figure who had been standing near the windows moments ago. Claire's pace remained steady and unhurried, the gentle fabric of her ivory dress moving with each step as the soft lights of the chandeliers reflected across the polished floor beneath her feet. Conversations that had filled the ballroom only seconds earlier faded into silence, replaced by a low whisper of recognition spreading from table to table like the first ripple of wind across still water. Daniel Carter watched the movement at first without understanding what he was seeing. He expected someone older, perhaps a senior executive or financial director from Whitmore Global Capital, a person whose reputation already carried weight across international markets. Instead he saw Claire walking forward with the calm composure he remembered from years ago, the same calm that used to steady him when his company existed only as a hopeful idea in a cramped midtown office. For a moment Daniel assumed she must be heading toward someone else, perhaps delivering a message to the real representative. But Claire did not stop. She continued forward until she reached the open space before the stage where the master of ceremonies stood waiting with a welcoming smile. The host extended his hand politely and Claire accepted it with a graceful nod. The room reacted almost instantly. Several guests leaned toward one another with quiet questions while others simply stared, trying to connect the elegant woman before them with the powerful financial name displayed above the stage. Olivia Grant's fingers tightened slightly around Daniel's arm as she spoke under her breath. "That cannot be right," she whispered, her eyes following Claire's movement with disbelief. Daniel did not answer. His gaze remained fixed on the stage while a slow realization began to rise in his thoughts like a distant storm forming across calm water. The master of ceremonies stepped aside and gestured toward Claire with genuine respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced warmly, his voice carrying through the hall with renewed clarity, "it is my honor to introduce the representative of Whitmore Global Capital who has chosen to support tonight's foundation." Claire stepped closer to the microphone, pausing briefly as the room settled into complete silence. The chandeliers above cast a gentle glow across her face while the skyline of Manhattan shimmered faintly through the tall windows behind the crowd. For several seconds she said nothing. She simply looked out across the sea of faces watching her now with growing curiosity. Then she spoke with a calm voice that carried easily across the room. "Good evening," she began, her tone steady and composed. "My name is Claire Whitmore." The effect was immediate. The whispers returned, louder now, filled with astonishment as the connection between the name and the glowing letters on the screen became unmistakably clear. Daniel Carter felt the words settle heavily in the silence around him. Claire Whitmore. The name repeated itself in his mind as he watched the woman he had dismissed only minutes earlier standing confidently beneath the Whitmore Global Capital banner. Claire allowed the murmurs to fade before continuing, her expression still serene. "My family has believed for many years that opportunity should create more than profit," she said softly. "It should create lasting change." Her eyes moved briefly across the crowd, and for the first time they paused on Daniel. The glance lasted only a second, calm and unreadable, but it carried more meaning than any speech could have. Because the man who had called her a nobody was now standing in a room where everyone finally understood exactly who she was. For a moment the entire ballroom remained suspended in silence, the kind of silence that only appears when hundreds of people suddenly realize they have misunderstood something important. The silver letters of Whitmore continued to glow behind Claire Whitmore as she stood calmly at the microphone, her posture relaxed, her voice steady, while the quiet murmur of recognition moved through the crowd like a slow rising tide. Daniel Carter felt the change in the room before he fully understood the reason for it. Investors who had been speaking with him earlier now glanced toward the stage with new interest, their expressions shifting as the connection between the elegant woman standing under the lights and the powerful Whitmore name settled into place. Olivia Grant remained beside him, her eyes fixed on Claire with a mixture of surprise and calculation, as though she were quietly reviewing every moment from earlier in the evening and measuring it against this new reality. Claire allowed the whispers to fade naturally before continuing, her tone warm yet composed in a way that suggested she was completely comfortable standing in front of a room filled with influential guests. She spoke about the purpose of the charity event and the importance of long-term community investment, explaining that Whitmore Global Capital believes successful companies carried a responsibility that extended far beyond their quarterly earnings. Her words were simple, thoughtful, and delivered with the calm assurance of someone who had spoken in rooms like this many times before. But for Daniel, the speech itself barely registered. His thoughts had drifted somewhere else entirely. He remembered the small office near Midtown where Carter Holdings began, the flicker of tired fluorescent lights above two desks pushed close together, and Claire sitting across from him late at night reviewing documents with quiet patience. He remembered how easily she solved problems that once seemed impossible, how calmly she handled investors who doubted them, and how often she encouraged him to think bigger when the company felt too fragile to survive. At the time he believed those moments were simply part of building a new business. Now he wondered how different they might have been if he had understood who Claire truly was even then. On the stage, Claire finished her remarks with a brief thank you to the foundation and stepped back as the master of ceremonies returned to the microphone, the audience responding with polite but enthusiastic applause. Several guests rose slightly from their chairs to greet her as she moved away from the podium, their expressions now filled with the respectful curiosity reserved for someone whose name carried enormous influence across global markets. Daniel watched the scene unfold with growing unease. The woman he had casually dismissed only minutes earlier was now surrounded by investors eager to introduce themselves. He lowered his glass slowly, realizing that the quiet confidence Claire had shown throughout the evening had never been uncertainty at all. It had been patience. As Claire stepped down from the stage, the crowd parted again to allow her through, and for a brief moment her gaze crossed the room until it met Daniel's once more. There was no anger in her expression, no sign of triumph either, only a calm awareness that the balance of the evening had changed completely. And standing there among the guests who now understood her importance, Daniel Carter felt the unsettling certainty that the past he had walked away from was now standing directly in front of him with a power he had never imagined. The applause slowly faded into a softer hum of conversation as guests returned to their tables and waiters resumed their quiet movement through the ballroom with trays of sparkling water and champagne. Yet the atmosphere had changed in a way that everyone could feel but no one openly said. A few minutes earlier Claire Whitmore had been nearly invisible among the crowd. Now every conversation seemed to include her name. Investors who had once spoken only about market forecasts were suddenly discussing Whitmore Global Capital with renewed interest, recalling past projects and international partnerships that had shaped industries across decades. Claire moved through the gathering calmly, offering polite handshakes and short conversations with several foundation board members who thanked her for supporting the evening's charity efforts. She listened attentively, her voice gentle and measured, yet her attention occasionally drifted toward the far side of the room where Daniel Carter still stood beside Olivia Grant. Daniel had not moved much since the announcement. He had expected many surprising moments in business over the years, but none quite like this one. He watched Claire from across the ballroom while his thoughts attempted to reorganize themselves around the reality he had just witnessed. The woman who had once sat beside him in a 600-square-foot office was now the representative of one of the most powerful investment families in the financial world. Olivia finally broke the silence between them. "You knew her," she said quietly, her voice calm but clearly curious. Daniel nodded slowly. "A long time ago," he replied, choosing his words carefully. Olivia studied his expression for a moment as if trying to read something hidden beneath his composure. Around them the music returned as the small orchestra began another gentle piece, the sound filling the space between conversations like a calm river flowing through a crowded city. On the other side of the room Claire had finished speaking with a group of donors and stepped toward one of the tall windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The night outside remained clear, the lights of the city stretching across the horizon, while distant traffic moved like small lines of gold far below the gallery's elevated view. For a brief moment she allowed herself a quiet pause, resting one hand lightly against the cool glass as she looked out at the familiar city where so many chapters of her life had begun. She heard footsteps approach behind her and turned slightly, expecting another introduction or polite greeting from one of the event organizers. Instead she saw Daniel Carter standing a few feet away, his posture careful and uncertain in a way she had rarely seen before. The confident tone he used earlier in the evening had disappeared. Now his voice carried something closer to reflection. "Claire," he said, speaking her name slowly as though confirming it was real. She met his gaze with the same calm expression she had maintained all evening. "Daniel," she replied. The simple exchange felt strangely formal considering the years they once shared building a company together. Daniel hesitated for a moment before continuing. "I did not know," he admitted quietly. Claire tilted her head slightly, not in confusion but in gentle acknowledgement of what he meant. The truth was simple. He had never asked. The city lights reflected softly in the window beside them while the music drifted through the ballroom again. Around them guests continued their conversations, unaware that the quiet moment unfolding near the glass carried the weight of a past neither of them had completely forgotten. And as Daniel Carter stood there facing the woman he once believed he understood, he began to realize that the story he thought had ended years ago was only just beginning to reveal itself. Daniel Carter stood beside the tall window for a few seconds after speaking Claire's name, as if the simple word had carried more weight than he expected. The quiet glow of Manhattan stretched beyond the glass while the orchestra continued playing somewhere behind them, the soft music drifting through the ballroom like a distant current. Claire Whitmore remained composed, her posture relaxed, her attention resting on Daniel with the calm patience that once steadied long nights of planning in a small midtown office. For a moment neither of them spoke again. Around them the charity auction resumed, guests lifting numbered paddles while the auctioneer's confident voice called out rising bids that climbed steadily into six figures. The room had returned to its elegant rhythm, yet the small space near the window felt separate from the rest of the evening, almost as if the past had quietly stepped back into the present and was waiting to be acknowledged. Daniel finally exhaled softly, lowering his voice so their conversation remained private. "If I had known who you were," he began carefully, then stopped himself before finishing the sentence. Claire watched him with a faint, thoughtful expression. "Would anything have changed?" she asked gently. Her question was not accusatory. It sounded more like quiet curiosity. Daniel hesitated again. The honest answer was not simple. Years earlier he had believed ambition required difficult decisions, and at the time leaving Claire behind had seemed like one of them. Now the memory of those choices felt less certain. "I suppose I thought I understood the whole story back then," he admitted slowly. Claire glanced toward the ballroom where investors continued discussing deals over champagne and polished silver trays of hors d'oeuvres. "Most people think they understand things while they are happening," she said softly. "It is only later that the full picture becomes clear." Daniel followed her gaze across the room and noticed how many people were now watching her with quiet interest. Several guests had already begun asking foundation staff for introductions to the Whitmore representative. The realization settled deeper into his thoughts. 4 years Carter Holdings had been negotiating for an opportunity to work with Whitmore Global Capital. The company's expansion plans depended on finding the right international partner, and Whitmore had always been near the top of that list. Daniel turned back toward Claire with a careful expression. "Are you the one making those decisions now?" he asked. Claire allowed a small smile to appear, not proud or dramatic, simply acknowledging reality. "My family believes in shared leadership," she replied. "But yes, I represent Whitmore Global Capital in several partnerships." Daniel nodded slowly as the meaning of her words unfolded. The future of his company, the deals he had spent months pursuing, might now depend on the woman he once believed had nothing to offer his ambitions. Across the ballroom Olivia Grant watched the conversation from a distance, her thoughtful eyes moving between Daniel and Claire, while the auctioneer's voice announced another successful bid. Claire noticed the glance and turned slightly back toward the window where the city lights shimmered below. "It is a beautiful view," she said quietly. Daniel looked out at the skyline beside her, the river reflecting silver beneath the bridges stretching across the dark water. "New York always looks impressive from above," he replied. Claire nodded once, then added gently, "Perspective changes everything." The words were simple, yet Daniel felt their meaning settle heavily in the quiet space between them. Only hours earlier he had believed Claire Whitmore was a forgotten part of his past. Now she stood beside him as someone whose influence could shape his company's future. And for the first time that evening Daniel Carter began to understand that the direction of the night might no longer belong to him at all. The music in the ballroom continued, with gentle elegance while the charity auction moved into its final rounds, yet the quiet conversation near the window carried a gravity that felt heavier than any bid announced from the stage. Daniel Carter remained standing beside Claire Whitmore, the reflection of the Manhattan skyline stretching across the glass behind them like a silent witness to a conversation years in the making. For a long moment he simply watched the city lights flicker across the river, gathering his thoughts as the reality of the evening continued to settle around him. The orchestra shifted into a slower melody and the auctioneer's voice rose again from the center of the room, announcing another rare art piece donated by a private collector. Guests responded with polite enthusiasm, raising numbered paddles while assistants moved gracefully between tables to record the offers. Yet Daniel's attention remained fixed on the woman beside him. "I spent months trying to arrange a meeting with Whitmore Global Capital," he admitted quietly at last. "Your advisors always responded with careful language, but they never revealed who would represent the company in person." Claire listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful but calm. "Our firm prefers to observe before committing to a partnership," she replied gently. "Sometimes it is better to understand a company fully before entering an agreement." Daniel nodded slowly as he considered her words. The explanation made perfect sense from a strategic perspective, yet it also carried an unspoken layer of meaning that lingered between them. Claire had not simply been observing Carter Holdings as an outsider. She had once been part of the foundation that built it. Across the ballroom a group of investors approached the stage to congratulate the foundation board members on the evening's success. Olivia Grant remained near the cocktail table where she had been earlier, watching Daniel and Claire with a careful expression while occasionally speaking with other guests who passed by. The distance between them felt noticeable now, not dramatic but quietly significant. Daniel glanced briefly in her direction before returning his attention to Claire. "If Whitmore is considering new partnerships," he said slowly, "I would still welcome the opportunity to present Carter Holdings properly." The words were professional, yet they carried a hint of something more personal beneath the surface. Claire turned slightly toward him, the soft light from the chandeliers reflecting in her eyes as she studied his expression. "Carter Holdings has grown impressively," she acknowledged. "I have followed its progress for several years." Daniel was not surprised by that answer, but hearing it spoken directly by Claire made the statement feel different. It meant that even after leaving his life she had continued watching the company they once imagined together. The orchestra paused briefly as the auctioneer announced the final item of the evening, a sculpture donated by a renowned artist whose work had recently sold for several $1,000,000 at a New York gallery. Applause rippled across the room while guests prepared for the last round of bidding. Claire looked toward the stage for a moment before returning her attention to Daniel. "Business decisions require careful evaluation," she said calmly. "Whitmore Global Capital does not rush them." Daniel understood the message immediately. The future of Carter Holdings was not guaranteed simply because they shared a history. Whatever came next would depend on the choices Claire and her family made from this point forward. He nodded respectfully, accepting the balance that now existed between them. As the bidding began again in the background and the bright lights of the stage reflected across the ballroom floor, Daniel Carter realized that the most important negotiation of the evening was no longer happening on stage at all. It was unfolding quietly beside a window overlooking the city, between two people whose past had once been inseparable, and whose future had suddenly become uncertain again. The final round of bidding rose steadily beneath the bright stage lights while the sculpture on display rotated slowly on its pedestal, casting elegant shadows across the polished floor of the ballroom. Guests lifted their numbered paddles with growing enthusiasm as the auctioneer's confident voice carried through the hall, announcing each new offer in calm, measured tones that echoed beneath the crystal chandeliers overhead. Claire Whitmore and Daniel Carter remained near the tall window overlooking the city. Their quiet conversation momentarily paused while both listened to the rhythm of the auction unfolding behind them. The Manhattan skyline shimmered in the glass beside them, a sea of light stretching across the river, and into the distance where the dark outline of bridges connected one glowing neighborhood to another. Daniel finally turned slightly toward Claire again, his posture thoughtful rather than tense, as though he had spent the last few minutes reconsidering far more than a single business proposal. "You always believed the company could become something larger," he said slowly, his voice calm enough that it barely rose above the soft music drifting through the room. Claire's eyes moved briefly toward him, acknowledging the memory. "You believed it too," she replied gently. Daniel allowed a faint smile to appear. "I did," he admitted. "But I also believed success required certain choices." Claire did not respond immediately. Instead, she watched the reflection of the ballroom lights flicker against the glass, her expression composed but distant for a moment, as if the years between their shared past and the present had passed quietly through her thoughts. "Sometimes the most important choices are the ones we only understand later," she said at last. Her tone carried no bitterness, only quiet certainty. The auctioneer's voice suddenly rose with excitement as the sculpture's price crossed another major milestone, and a wave of applause swept across the crowd. Daniel glanced back toward the stage, then returned his attention to Claire with a new question forming in his mind. "You said Whitmore Global Capital does not rush decisions," he began carefully. "Does that mean you have already evaluated Carter Holdings?" Claire tilted her head slightly, considering the question with the calm precision of someone accustomed to complex negotiations. "Every company that approaches Whitmore receives a full evaluation," she answered. "Your company included." Daniel nodded, accepting the straightforward reply, though curiosity still lingered in his expression. "And what did that evaluation conclude?" Claire studied him quietly for a second before responding. The music shifted again, softer now, while the final bids continued climbing across the ballroom. "It concluded that Carter Holdings has remarkable potential," she said. "The growth over the last few years has been impressive." Daniel listened closely, recognizing the careful balance in her words. Potential was promising, but it was not the same as commitment. Across the room, Olivia Grant continued speaking with several investors, occasionally glancing toward the window where Daniel and Claire stood together in conversation. Claire noticed the glance again and then returned her attention to Daniel with the same composed expression she had maintained all evening. "But Whitmore Global Capital evaluates more than numbers," she continued calmly. "We also look at leadership, values, and long-term vision." Daniel understood the implication immediately. The evaluation was not only about financial growth. It was about the people guiding it. The auctioneer's voice rang out once more as the sculpture finally sold for a remarkable sum, drawing another wave of applause and celebration from the guests. As the room brightened again with conversation and congratulations, Daniel Carter looked back at Claire Whitmore and realized that the most important judgment of his career might not come from investors, markets, or shareholders at all. It might come from the quiet woman standing beside him who had once believed in his ambitions before anyone else did. The applause that followed the final auction results slowly softened into relaxed conversation as the evening began transitioning from formal bidding to quiet celebration, waiters moving gracefully between tables with trays of sparkling water and champagne, while the orchestra shifted into a gentle closing melody. Claire Whitmore remained near the tall window for another moment before turning slightly toward the room again, the reflection of the Manhattan skyline fading behind her as the warm lights of the ballroom returned to focus. Daniel Carter watched her carefully, aware that the conversation they had just shared carried consequences far beyond the quiet corner where they stood. For years he had believed that success was a straight path defined by determination, timing, and the willingness to make difficult decisions. Yet standing beside Claire now, he could see how incomplete that belief had been. She had once stood beside him when the future of Carter Holdings was uncertain, long before investors filled rooms like this with confident applause. And now she stood here again, not as a forgotten partner from the past, but as someone whose influence could shape what happened next. Claire noticed the thoughtful expression on his face and offered a calm, polite smile that carried neither pride nor resentment. "The evening has been successful for the foundation," she said quietly, glancing toward the stage where several organizers were thanking guests for their generosity. Daniel nodded, though his thoughts were still focused on the larger question hanging quietly between them. And for Whitmore Global Capital, he added carefully. Claire's gaze returned to him with gentle attentiveness. Possibly, she replied. Her answer was simple, yet it carried the careful neutrality of someone who never allowed emotion to guide a professional decision. Across the ballroom, Olivia Grant approached slowly, her posture graceful and confident as she joined them near the window. She offered Claire a courteous smile, the kind shared between accomplished professionals who understood the significance of the evening. Miss Whitmore, Olivia said warmly, extending her hand. I have heard about your family's work for years. It is a pleasure to finally meet you. Claire accepted the handshake with the same composed politeness she had shown all night. The pleasure is mine, Miss Grant, she replied. The exchange remained brief but respectful, and for a moment the three of them stood together in a small circle overlooking the glittering city beyond the glass. Olivia glanced between Daniel and Claire with thoughtful curiosity before speaking again. Daniel mentioned earlier that Carter Holdings has been hoping to collaborate with Whitmore Global Capital, she said. Claire listened quietly, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. Yes, Daniel added, choosing his words with care. We have been preparing for that opportunity for quite some time. Claire considered the statement for a moment, then nodded slowly. I am aware, she said. Her tone remained calm, yet it carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly how much weight her decision would carry. The orchestra's melody drifted gently through the ballroom, while guests continued exchanging congratulations around them. After a brief pause, Claire looked directly at Daniel again, her voice soft but clear. Your company has grown beyond the small office where it began, she said. That alone deserves recognition. Daniel inclined his head slightly in appreciation, though he sensed there was more she intended to say. Claire allowed another second of silence before continuing. But growth is only part of what Whitmore evaluates, she added. Character matters just as much. The words settled quietly in the space between them. Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he simply acknowledged the truth in her statement with a thoughtful nod. And as the final moments of the charity evening unfolded around them, Daniel Carter understood that the future he had once believed was entirely under his control now depended on something far more complex than ambition alone. The ballroom had gradually shifted into a calmer rhythm as the formal program concluded, the orchestra continuing its soft melody while clusters of guests gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers exchanging final conversations before the evening ended. Claire Whitmore stood with quiet composure beside the tall window, the reflection of Manhattan's glowing skyline still stretching across the glass like a field of distant stars. Daniel Carter remained nearby, aware that the conversation unfolding between them had moved beyond simple introductions or polite networking. Across the room, the foundation's organizers thanked donors for their generosity, while waiters collected empty glasses and replaced them with fresh sparkling water. Olivia Grant stood with them for a moment longer before politely excusing herself to greet another group of investors, leaving Claire and Daniel once again in a quieter space overlooking the city. Daniel watched her go, then turned his attention back to Claire with a thoughtful expression that carried more humility than the confidence he had shown earlier in the evening. You were right about something earlier, he said slowly. Claire raised her eyes toward him with calm curiosity. Perspective, she asked gently. Daniel nodded. Yes. I think I finally understand what you meant. Claire did not respond immediately. She simply waited, allowing him the space to continue if he wished. Daniel looked out across the skyline for a moment, the distant lights reflecting faintly in his glass as he considered the long path that had brought both of them back to this room. When we were building the company, he said quietly, I believed ambition meant always moving forward without looking back. Claire listened with the same patience she once carried during late nights in that small office years ago. Daniel continued, his voice steady but reflective. Tonight I realized that some of the most important parts of the journey were standing beside me all along. Claire's expression softened slightly, not with triumph but with recognition. People often discover that truth later than they expect, she replied. Daniel gave a faint smile at the accuracy of the statement. The orchestra's melody drifted gently across the room while guests began gathering their coats and preparing to leave the event. Daniel took a quiet breath before speaking again. I do not expect the past to change, he said. But I would like the chance to prove that the future can. Claire studied him for a moment, her gaze thoughtful but steady. The confidence she carried did not come from wealth or status alone. It came from the quiet understanding that she no longer needed anything from the man standing before her. Whitmore Global Capital does not make decisions based on old memories, she said calmly. Only on present realities. Daniel inclined his head respectfully. Then I hope Carter Holdings can demonstrate those realities clearly. Claire allowed a small pause before answering. Perhaps it already has, she replied. Daniel looked at her with mild surprise. Claire continued gently. Your company's growth shows determination. Your willingness to stand here tonight and speak honestly shows something more important. The quiet sincerity in her words carried more weight than applause ever could. Around them the ballroom continued emptying as the final guests thanked the foundation organizers and stepped toward the exit beneath the glowing chandeliers. Claire glanced once more toward the skyline outside before turning back to Daniel. Whitmore Global Capital will be reviewing several partnerships in the coming months, she said. Carter Holdings will be included in that review. Daniel understood exactly what that meant. It was not a promise, but it was not a dismissal either. As the last notes of the orchestra's melody faded into the soft echo of departing footsteps, Daniel Carter realized that the opportunity he had been chasing for months had never been about finding the right investor. It had been about rediscovering the respect he once overlooked in the person who believed in him first. The final guests slowly moved toward the exit beneath the soft glow of the chandeliers, their quiet conversations fading into the distant hallway as the charity gala reached its natural close. Waiters cleared the remaining glasses from tables while the orchestra packed away their instruments, leaving the ballroom filled with a calm silence that felt very different from the excitement that had filled the room earlier in the evening. Claire Whitmore remained near the tall window for a moment longer, the reflection of Manhattan's skyline still stretching across the glass like a quiet reminder of how large the world beyond the ballroom truly was. The city lights shimmered across the river while traffic moved far below like small golden threads weaving through the streets. Daniel Carter stood beside her, no longer speaking, as if the conversation they had just shared had finally reached the point where words were no longer necessary. For years he had measured success in numbers, contracts, and opportunities gained through persistence and timing. Yet tonight had revealed something he had not expected to face again. The past he once left behind had returned, not with anger or accusation, but with quiet strength. Claire finally turned away from the window and reached for her small evening bag resting on the nearby table. Her movements remained composed, unhurried, the same calm confidence that had carried her through every moment of the evening from the first quiet entrance into the ballroom to the moment her name appeared beneath the Whitmore banner above the stage. Daniel watched her for a second before speaking softly. Claire. She paused and looked toward him, her expression open but steady. Daniel seemed to search briefly for the right words, though both of them understood that many things no longer needed to be explained. You built more than a company back then, he said slowly. You built belief. Claire listened quietly, the faintest hint of a smile appearing as she considered the statement. Belief is powerful, she replied gently, but it only matters if people carry it forward. Daniel nodded once, accepting the truth of that idea. The evening had shown him something he had overlooked for years. Claire Whitmore had never needed recognition to prove her worth. She had simply continued moving forward, building a life and a legacy far larger than the small chapter they once shared. Outside, a sleek black car waited along the curb where the final guests were stepping into the cool New York night. Claire glanced toward the entrance as if noticing the quiet signal that it was time to leave. She turned back to Daniel one last time, her voice calm and sincere. Your company still has potential, she said. What you choose to do with that potential will define everything that comes next. Daniel understood the meaning immediately. Opportunity had returned to him, but this time it came with something far more valuable than investment capital. Came with perspective. Claire offered a final polite nod before walking toward the exit, her footsteps soft against the marble floor as she passed beneath the fading lights of the ballroom. Daniel remained near the window for a moment longer, watching the skyline where the city continued moving with quiet determination. For the first time in years he realized that success was not simply about reaching the top of a building or signing the largest deal. Sometimes it was about recognizing the people who believed in the dream before the world ever noticed it. Outside, the door of the waiting car closed gently as Claire Whitmore disappeared into the New York night. Daniel Carter stood alone beside the window, understanding at last that the woman he once called a nobody had never needed revenge at all. She had simply become someone the world could no longer overlook.